And welcome, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful Apologetics Dojo. Welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. We are looking at answering common objections. And the common objection we're looking at specifically is, where do you get this idea that Mary was assumed bodily into heaven? And we have Ken Litchfield with us. And Ken, already you've laid down some really great lines of argument. So why don't we continue from there?
Great. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, the church declared that Mary had been assumed into heaven in 1950, and some people accuse the Catholic Church of just making it up in 1950. So now we'll dig back into the archives and get the historical references on how we know that from the very beginning. So from very early on, it was clear that there were no relics of Mary. There weren't any churches, there weren't any bishops, there weren't any people claiming that they had first-class relics of Mary, like her bones or anything like that. There was a place that was attributed as her tomb, but just like Jesus' tomb, it was empty. In 180 AD, Melito of Sardis wrote a corrective version of the Assumption of Mary, because there was a guy named Lucentius wrote a heretical letter about Mary not being assumed into heaven. So he wrote this letter, establishing correct church doctrine to refute this guy. And there's also a feast called the Memory of Mary that was celebrated very early on in the early 300s. During the rule of the Emperor Lucius Verus in Rome, the churches in Gaul wrote to the church during the Roman persecution, and this is recorded by Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History. And in the quoted letter, someone from the church in Gaul writes that those in prison died are filled with God's grace and greeted in heaven by the Virgin Mary. So already right there in 160 even, Christians are recognizing that they're greeted in heaven by Mary. Let's see. Also in the early 300s, there's a quote from Timothy of Jerusalem. If therefore it might come to pass by the power of your grace, it has appeared right to us, to your servants, that as you, having overcome death, do reign in glory, so you should raise up the body of your mother, and take her with you, rejoicing into heaven. Then said the Savior, Jesus, be it done according to your will. So this is from a writing called The Passing of the Virgin. And it's in chapter 16, verses 2 through 17 in this writing called Timothy of Jerusalem. In the Eastern churches, they refer to the Dormition of Mary, which doesn't specify whether she died or was just assumed into heaven. But dormition means falling asleep. So the tradition that they have in the Eastern churches is that when Mary fell asleep, whether we want to call that death or just like a coma or whatever, Jesus came and transported her soul in a smaller version of Mary, and the angels that came with him transported her body to heaven. So that was a common belief very early in the church, the Eastern church. In the Western church, most of the art depicts the Assumption of Mary as her going up into heaven without death. But there are a few pieces of art that show her having a funeral. So ultimately, whether she was alive at the time of her death, her Assumption, or not, is not really important. It's just that we know that she is now in heaven. In 431 at the Council of Ephesus, Mary was universally recognized as the Mother of God, and to confirm that Jesus was both man and God, and not just a God in a man's body. So we know that the early church understood Mary as being the mother of God, and therefore, following 1 Kings chapter 2, she would be on the throne of the Queen of Heaven, along with her son, the King of Heaven, on David's throne. In 451 AD, at the Council of Chalcedon, where the two consubstantial natures of Christ were declared dogma, the Roman emperor at that time, who was a Christian by that time, asked for a relic of Mary to add to his collection of relics on the apostles. And St. Juvenal explains to him that we have no true relics of Mary because she was assumed into heaven. So here we have a chain of evidence from 160s AD through 180, the early 300s, the early 400s, the mid 400s, and even, for Protestants, in the book Heaven is for Real, which is a story about this boy who was not quite 5 years old, and he had an appendectomy and visited heaven at that time. And he reports that he saw Mary sitting next to Jesus in heaven. And Colton was not quite 5 years old and the son of a Wesleyan minister, where they don't teach much about Mary. So he reported that Mary was there, and he had no skin in the game at all. And also, we have, again, churches have the first-class relics of the apostles, but no church is claiming to have a first-class relic of Mary.
Right. Yeah, and it's an argument from silence, but it's an important one, isn't it? Because in the early church, the early Christians relished, the remains of the saints, especially the martyrs.
Right. There's plenty of reports, where the martyrs their relics are saved and revered for many years after that. So we know that if there were relics of Mary, they would have saved them. But we don't have any, so we don't have them.
Yeah, I mean, we have the relics of the apostles. We have the relics of Paul. The earliest martyrs. It's inconceivable that they would neglect to have some sort of relic of the mother of Jesus.
Right.